everyone, it's Jamie, and I hope everyone is doing okay. Quick life update. I actually got food poisoning 3 days ago after I ordered for the first time from this new 24-hour diner place at 2 a.m. I have a lot of regrets in this moment, but today I'm here to talk about Barsh Cranston Lewis's chapter 4 of How Remarkable Women Lead. So I found this chapter actually very light and inspiring in a way, but it also brought up some questions that I'm going to discuss later on. So first, the chapter opens up about sort of talking about where we can get the deepest amount of satisfaction. So it's through simply deploying our strengths into activities where we choose out of interest, but also are good at. So you get that satisfaction and engagement. And ultimately, when you do find something you enjoy and you're good and talented at it, it maximizes your purpose, meaning, utility, and satisfaction altogether. And they really emphasize this idea of finding your purpose or having a purpose all throughout this particular reading. Because purpose underscores just about everything that we set out to do. And in that way, purpose really drives us and directs us through life. It sort of pushes us into directions that we may or may not particularly enjoy, but we go through just so that we can find that really specific end goal that we have in mind for ourselves. And they really underscore that by having this purpose in what we're doing, we can make ultimately a larger difference in the world and also enjoy the deepest level of happiness. So the chapter goes on to talk a little bit about Jerry Laybourne, who was the founder and former CEO of Oxygen Networks, which I remember as a child I used to love watching reruns and sitcoms on. So a little history about Jerry. She was raised as one of the 3 daughters of a businessman and an artist, but she was raised as that designated business child. Her father would take her through to meetings at his office and also sort of like quizzed her on like stock symbols and really sort of gave her a very early understanding of what business was like in the real world from a very young age. But she sort of took a different direction and actually headed into liberal arts college where she studied architecture. And then later pursued a teaching degree and worked at a private school. She saw how much satisfaction that her husband found in his work as a teacher at inner city schools, specifically taught how to make movies. But by the time she joined Nickelodeon in 1980, she became an expert on the ways that kids watched media. So she eventually pioneered this specific type of children's cable television where these programs weren't made in a way that talked down to children, but rather sort of talked to them as equals, and the quote calls it respectful entertainment. Jerry's aspirations for Nickelodeon was more about changing the world and the TV landscape for kids rather than furthering her own personal goals and careers. And she notes that she felt lucky for having the chance to be a pioneer in what was, risky new field. She notes that no one was competing from those traditional old boy networks. And she recalls that women in cable were often given breaks by those who sympathized with their being in a loser profession. So the women in her business were passionate explorers unhindered by tradition and customs. So she comments that this new generation of women emerging from business schools start working or searching without understanding their purpose. Whereas Jerry, worked this very fulfilling, satisfactory professional life by starting off with that purpose and then extending from there. And her opinion matches the research done by Barsh Cranston and Lewis, who are the authors of this reading. And they found that meaning matters to both men and women, but more women look for their work to be meaningful, which I think is a very important distinction. So what that also means is that men are much more concerned about who's on top and think about their work in terms of sort of economics, like sort of one man's treasure is another man's trash kind of situation, meaning that they thought of their work in their professional life in terms of losers and winners, whereas women thought about the greater good beyond their personal successes. So what they ultimately came to is this point about what makes you happy, what also builds on your strengths and taps into your purpose, makes you an aspiring leader. And when you have a purpose and it's shared by the team, leading becomes much easier because everyone has that shared singular vision. But Jerry also advises that women need to extend their vision from the micro to the macro level, meaning that you need to focus not on, what's immediately in front of you, sort of those thoughts about who is outperforming your department or who's ahead of you, but sort of that greater goal that enriches everyone, not just the self. Ultimately, I really thought about this as this need to think and strive to create an environment where you would like to work and find the most fulfilling rather than what is going to make you happy in the short run. Things like looking at income, benefits, or things that will, make you seem like a leader without necessarily feeling like one. Because when you have a purpose in life and a purpose for your work, you're making a difference for the people around you. And that's another really interesting distinction the authors make. Because they underscore, again, with purpose, setting goals becomes easier and you find the courage to face new challenges and to believe what is possible. So they say that daring to dream is a big, purposeful goal. And as you work toward it, you feel that you're serving your purpose in some way and feel a sense of fulfillment. But the questions that I began to have throughout this reading are maybe a little pessimistic, not as optimistic as the tone of this overall chapter. So for me, when, the question of how to find what holds meaning for a person, the text actually suggests this idea of making 3 lists. So the lists sort of account for, what kind of activities you enjoy and what you're good at. Then you extend that thinking into what's important to you, and you start to look for patterns across your list and compare it to what you're doing today. But I'm really skeptical about that, about the reality of adapting the work to your purpose. I think it's extremely idealistic and optimistic, and I don't think we often hear those types of examples a lot. We, of course, hear about Jerry Laybourne, but I think in a more realistic or at least general sense, not everyone has that luxury of having a purpose and then, sort of accommodating their work to it rather than the other way around. And I'm also asking myself, is fulfillment feasible in a realistic setting? Meaning that, again, not everyone has the luxury to feel fulfilled from their work. I think oftentimes people do have these lofty goals and you can take little steps to get to them. But oftentimes I think people, because of their life experiences or certain stations in life, whether that be sort of those like intersectional identities we've talked about, their race, gender, etc., or sexuality, etc., I think they can essentially be blocks to finding that sense of fulfillment. And I find the idea that they mentioned about finding a robust, meaty goal really interesting. They basically say that you need this type of, protein goal to sustain you, but I ask myself, when does it stop sustaining you? And when and where do you draw the line in deciding when a goal is no longer fit for you? And is it feasible that you can immediately drop that goal / job? Oftentimes you can't, which is why I keep sort of going back and forth with this idea of like what types of goals or purposes should you have to find, or what type of purpose should you have that would sort of cater to this larger fulfillment, which you can also work into a job, like, if that makes sense. I'm not sure it entirely does, but the whole point is that I really do enjoy the things that are being said, but I have to ask myself, especially for women, especially with women who also have several other identities, whether it's, like I said, race, gender, sexuality, how feasible is all of this? It's nice to think about, it's nice to read about, but is this possible in this right now world? I don't know, food for thought.